January 17, 1945, near the frozen Belgian village of Büllingen, Ardennes Forest. The snow fell in slow, heavy silence. It muffled the distant rumble of artillery, softened the edges of blackened trees, and clung to the wool collars of 21 Wehrmacht soldiers trudging through the frozen undergrowth. Their breath rose in pale clouds. Their boots crunched through ice that had hardened overnight. Behind them, the war had become a blur of retreat and confusion. Ahead of them, through the white veil of winter, lay what they believed to be salvation, an American encampment, quiet and sprawled across a shallow ridge. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann raised a gloved hand. The column halted. He could see the tents now, half-collapsed canvas structures dusted with frost. He could see the tire tracks in the snow, wide and careless, the kind left by American trucks that never seemed to worry about being followed. He could hear nothing, no voices, no engines, just the whisper of wind through skeletal branches. Hartmann had been a soldier for 6 years. He had marched into Poland with pride, into France with confidence, and into Russia with cold, disciplined determination. But now, in the winter of 1945, pride had frozen into something harder and more brittle. His men were hungry, they were tired, and they were surrounded by an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere, with weapons that roared louder, vehicles that moved faster, and supplies that never seemed to run dry. He motioned forward. The men spread out in a loose skirmish line, rifles raised, eyes scanning the tree line. They moved slowly, carefully, expecting resistance, but there was none. The camp was silent, abandoned perhaps, or a trap. Hartmann stepped into the clearing first. His boots sank into the snow. He swept his carabiner across the empty space, then lowered it slightly. One of his men, a young corporal named Ernst, moved toward the nearest tent and pulled back the flap. Inside, crates, stacks of them, wooden, stamped with English letters none of them could fully read. Ernst pried one open with the butt of his rifle, and then he stopped. Inside were rations, American field rations, tins of meat, bars of chocolate, packets of cigarettes, coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute they had been choking down for months. Ernst's hands trembled as he lifted a tin, turned it over, read the label in broken English, beef stew. Here ist alles. Here is everything. Within seconds, the other soldiers abandoned their defensive positions and rushed toward the crates. They tore into them with the desperation of men who had not eaten a full meal in weeks. Hartmann tried to restore order, but even he felt the pull of it, the abundance, the absurd, almost obscene plenty of it all. How could the Americans leave this behind? How could they afford to? One soldier found a crate of ammunition, another found medical supplies, bandages still sealed in paper, morphine vials gleaming in the pale winter light. A third found a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes, 20 packs deep, untouched. He laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound, the kind of laugh that comes when reality stops making sense. But Klaus Hartmann did not laugh. He stood at the edge of the camp, rifle still raised, eyes fixed on the tree line. Something was wrong. The Americans did not leave camps like this unless they had a reason. They did not abandon supplies unless they no longer needed them, or unless they were coming back. And then he heard it. A low, mechanical hum, distant at first, but growing. Not the growl of a tank, not the whine of a truck engine. Something else. Something higher pitched, almost insect-like in its persistence. Hartmann turned. His eyes scanned the sky, and then he saw them. 3 dark shapes cutting through the gray winter clouds. They moved with unnatural speed, their wings angled back like hunting birds. American aircraft, fighter bombers, and they were descending. "Deckung!" Hartmann screamed. "Take cover!" But it was too late. The men were scattered.
Some were still elbow-deep in crates. Others had dropped their rifles to tear open chocolate bars. A few had lit cigarettes, the first they'd smoked in days. They were not soldiers in that moment. They were scavengers, and scavengers do not survive in open ground. The first plane came in low, engines shrieking. Hartman threw himself into the snow as the .50 caliber machine guns opened fire. The sound was not like rifle fire. It was deeper, heavier, a rolling thunder that shook the air itself. The snow around him erupted in geysers of white and red. He heard screaming. He heard the wet, tearing sound of bullets punching through flesh and bone. The second plane followed, strafing the camp from the opposite direction. Tents exploded into shreds of canvas, crates splintered into kindling. A man ran, Ernst maybe, or someone who looked like him, and then he was gone, torn apart in a single burst of fire that left nothing but a smear of crimson across the snow. The third plane dropped something, a single object, tumbling end over end through the air. Hartman saw it, recognized it, and pressed his face into the frozen earth. The explosion lifted him off the ground. For a moment, there was no sound at all, only pressure, a crushing weight that squeezed the air from his lungs and filled his skull with white noise. And then he was back in the snow, gasping, ears ringing, vision blurred. When he lifted his head, the camp was gone. In its place was a crater, wide and smoking, ringed with debris. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls. Some were still moving, crawling, reaching for rifles they would never fire again. Others were silent, their eyes open and empty, staring up at the gray sky, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. Hartman tried to stand. His legs would not obey. He looked down and saw blood, dark and spreading, soaking through his trousers. He did not feel pain. Not yet. Only a distant, floating numbness, as if his body had become something separate from himself. He turned his head. Across the snow, half buried in the wreckage, was a tin of beef stew. It was dented, but intact.
The label was still visible, bright and cheerful, promising warmth and nourishment. Hartman stared at it. And then he laughed. It was a hollow, broken sound, barely human. The planes circled once more, then disappeared into the clouds. The forest was silent again. The snow continued to fall. Of the 21 men who had entered that camp, only 3 were still alive by the time the American patrol arrived an hour later. Hartman was one of them. He did not resist when they lifted him onto a stretcher. He did not speak when they asked him questions in halting German. He only stared at the tin of beef stew, still clutched in his frostbitten hand. 45 seconds. That was how long the engagement lasted, from the first burst of machine gun fire to the final pass of the aircraft. 45 seconds to transform 21 soldiers from hunters into prey, from men into casualties. 45 seconds to demonstrate a truth that had been written into every battlefield of the Second World War, but which the Wehrmacht, in its retreat through the Ardennes, was only beginning to fully comprehend. The Americans did not merely fight with soldiers, they fought with systems. The fighter bombers that had descended on that frozen camp were P-47 Thunderbolts, part of the 19th Tactical Air Command, a unit specifically tasked with providing close air support to ground forces during the Battle of the Bulge. The Thunderbolt was not the fastest plane in the sky, nor the most maneuverable, but it was heavily armed, capable of carrying bombs, rockets, and 8.50 caliber machine guns, and it was built to survive enemy fire that would have shredded lighter aircraft. More importantly, it was part of a network, a vast, coordinated system of ground controllers, forward observers, and radio-equipped units that allowed American forces to call in air support with a speed and precision that no other army in the world could match. This was the advantage that Klaus Hartmann and his men had stumbled into. Not a tactical ambush, not a clever trap, but the sheer suffocating weight of American industrial and technological superiority. A machine so large and so efficient that it could afford to abandon entire camps of supplies because it knew with absolute certainty that more would arrive the next day. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, had been told they were launching a counterattack. They had been told they would catch the Americans off guard, that they would seize fuel depots and supply dumps, that they would turn the enemy's own abundance against them. And for the first few days, it seemed possible. German panzer columns punched through thinly defended American lines. Entire units were surrounded and forced to surrender. The weather was so poor that Allied aircraft were grounded, giving the Wehrmacht a brief, precious window of opportunity. But then the skies cleared, and the planes came. By mid-January 1945, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and relentless Allied bombing had crippled its ability to contest the skies. The Americans, by contrast, fielded thousands of aircraft, supported by a logistics network that stretched back across the Atlantic.
Fed by factories that never stopped, fueled by oil fields that never ran dry. When the weather improved, the skies over Belgium and Luxembourg turned into killing fields. German soldiers learned to move only at night. They learned to hide their vehicles under trees, to cover their tracks, to avoid open ground at all costs. But it was never enough. The Americans had radar. They had reconnaissance planes that flew too high to be shot down. They had forward air controllers embedded with infantry units, men who could radio in the coordinates of a target and have bombs falling on it within minutes. And they had abundance, the kind of abundance that seemed to Germanize almost supernatural. One captured Wehrmacht officer, interrogated by American intelligence in late January, described it this way: "We were told that America was a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, that they had no warrior spirit, that they would crumble under pressure. But when we saw their camps, when we saw the mountains of supplies, the endless convoys of trucks, the way they threw away equipment we would have fought to keep, we realized we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an economy, and you cannot kill an economy with rifles." This was the psychological wound that American abundance inflicted. It was not just the firepower, though that was devastating. It was the realization that the enemy could afford to be wasteful, that they could leave behind crates of food and ammunition and medical supplies because they had more, that they could lose a tank and replace it within days, lose a plane and have two more in the air by sunset. The Germans had been taught to conserve, to scavenge, to make every bullet count. The Americans did not need to count. Klaus Hartmann, lying in a field hospital bed with shrapnel wounds and frostbite, would later tell a Red Cross interviewer that the thing he remembered most clearly was not the sound of the planes, not the screams of his men, but the tin of beef stew. He remembered the weight of it in his hand, the bright colors of the label, the cheerful English words promising a meal that millions of American soldiers ate without a second thought. He remembered thinking, in that moment, that the war was already over, not because Germany would surrender tomorrow or next month or next year, but because a nation that could afford to package beef stew in brightly colored tins, ship it across an ocean, distribute it to every camp and foxhole, and then abandon it in the snow, that nation could not be beaten. The tin of beef stew became, in a way, a symbol, not in any official sense, not in any propaganda poster or military report, but in the quiet, unspoken understanding shared by both sides. For the Germans, it represented everything they had lost: the certainty of victory, the belief in their own superiority, the hope that discipline and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. For the Americans, it represented something they rarely thought about because it was so deeply woven into the fabric of their lives: the assumption of plenty, the idea that there would always be more food, more fuel, more ammunition, more planes, more tanks, more men.
This assumption was not arrogance, it was infrastructure. It was the product of decades of investment in roads and railways and factories and oil refineries. It was the result of a political system that, for all its flaws, had learned to mobilize resources on a continental scale. It was the legacy of Henry Ford's assembly lines, of the Tennessee Valley Authority, of the New Deal programs that had taught a generation of Americans that large-scale coordination was not only possible, but necessary. And it was the reason why, in the winter of 1945, the German army was starving while American soldiers complained about the monotony of their rations. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January. The German offensive, which had begun with such ferocity, collapsed under the combined weight of American firepower, logistics, and air superiority. The Wehrmacht retreated back across the German border, leaving behind thousands of dead, tens of thousands of prisoners, and the shattered remnants of its armored divisions. The war in Europe would continue for another 4 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Klaus Hartmann survived. He was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in France, then to England, and finally to a facility in upstate New York, where he spent the final months of the war working on a farm, harvesting crops under the supervision of a man who spoke no German and seemed utterly indifferent to the fact that Hartmann had once been his enemy. The food was good, better than good. There was meat at every meal, bread that was soft and white, vegetables that were fresh and abundant. Hartmann gained weight. He slept in a clean bed. He wrote letters to his family, not knowing if they were still alive. And sometimes, late at night, he would think about that camp in the snow. He would think about Ernst and the others, and the way they had died for a tin of beef stew. He would think about the planes and the bombs, and the casual, almost careless efficiency with which the Americans had erased 21 men from existence. And he would wonder if anyone, anywhere, was writing this down. If anyone would remember that this was not just a battle, not just a skirmish in a forgotten corner of a larger war, but a moment when the future became visible, when the old world, with its myths of warrior nobility and iron discipline, collided with the new world, with its factories and radios and airplanes, and was obliterated in 45 seconds. There is a photograph taken by an American combat photographer in late January 1945 that shows the aftermath of that engagement. It is not a famous photograph. It has never been reproduced in history books or displayed in museums, but it exists, filed away in the National Archives, labeled only with a date and a set of coordinates. The photograph shows a crater in the snow. Around it, scattered like leaves, are the remnants of wooden crates. In the foreground, half buried in frost, is a single tin of beef stew. The label is still intact, bright and cheerful, absurdly out of place in that gray, frozen landscape. And in the background, barely visible, is a shape that might be a body, or might be a shadow, or might be nothing at all. The photographer who took that picture wrote a note on the back of it, in pencil, barely legible after 80 years. They came for food. We gave them war. That sentence, more than any official report or strategic analysis, captures the terrible irony of that moment. The German soldiers had not been wrong to think the Americans were careless with their supplies. They had not been wrong to see opportunity in an abandoned camp. They had only been wrong to think that carelessness was weakness. In truth, it was the opposite. The Americans could afford to be careless because they had already won the deeper war, the war of production, of logistics, of systems. The shooting war, the war of bullets and bombs and bodies, was simply the final act. And so, on that January morning, 21 men died for a meal they would never eat. They died because they were hungry, and because the enemy they faced was not. They died because they believed, until the very end, that courage and discipline could overcome material disadvantage. They died because they did not understand, could not understand, that the real battle had been lost long before they ever set foot in that camp. The snow continued to fall. The tin of beef stew remained in the snow, undisturbed, a monument to nothing and everything, and the war, indifferent to symbols and meaning, ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. This is what the tin represented, not victory, not defeat, but the cold, impersonal logic of industrial warfare. The logic that said a nation with enough factories could afford to be generous, and a nation without them could not afford to survive. The logic that said abundance was not a luxury, but a weapon, perhaps the most devastating weapon of all. The logic that said the future belonged not to the bravest or the most disciplined, but to those who could produce more, ship more, waste more, and still have more left over. Klaus Hartmann understood this, eventually, not in words perhaps, but in the quiet, permanent way that trauma teaches. He understood that he and his men had not been killed by American soldiers. They had been killed by American civilization, by the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, by the oil fields of Texas, by the farms of Iowa and Kansas, by the railways and highways and shipping lanes that connected them all, by a system so vast and so efficient that it could afford to treat human life as just another resource to be managed, deployed, and, if necessary, expended. And in that understanding, there was a kind of terrible clarity. The war had not been about ideology or honor or national pride. It had been about capacity, about who could build more, faster, better, about who could turn an entire continent into a machine for producing soldiers and tanks and planes and bombs, and yes, beef stew. The Germans had lost that contest before the first shot was ever fired.
The snow melted in the spring. The bodies were buried. The camp was cleared away, the debris hauled off, the crater filled in. By summer, there was nothing left to mark the spot where 21 men had died. The forest grew back, the war moved on. And somewhere, in a prisoner of war camp in upstate New York, Klaus Hartmann sat in the sun and ate a sandwich made with white bread and real butter, and wondered if anyone, anywhere, would ever believe him.